Motivation is fundamental to our daily life. It's what allows us to get out of bed in the morning. It's what allows us to pursue long-term goals or short-term goals. Motivation and the chemistry of motivation is tightly wound in with the neurochemistry of movement. In fact, the same single molecule, dopamine, is responsible for our sense of motivation and for movement. However, whether or not we move, whether or not we want to move, whether or not we have the desire to overcome barriers of, they could be social barriers or financial barriers or time constraints, that depends on this molecule we call dopamine. It's a fascinating molecule, and it lies at the center of so many great things in life, and it lies at the center of so many terrible aspects of life, namely addiction and certain forms of mental disease. You might be surprised to learn that it's not all just about increasing dopamine. In particular, in some cases, that's the wrong thing to do. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. How the way that you're leading your life and the way that you're conceptualizing your goals can actually predict whether or not you're going to continue to pursue those goals, and therefore whether or not you will succeed in achieving those goals, as well as whether or not you will quit. There's a fundamental relationship between dopamine released in your brain and your desire to exert effort. And you can actually control the schedule of dopamine release, but it requires the appropriate knowledge. This is one of those cases where understanding the way the dopamine system works will allow you to leverage it to your benefit. And if you don't understand the way that dopamine works, there's a good chance that it's going to pull you out into the current of life, meaning the rest of the world is going to control your dopamine schedules. Motivation is a two-part process, which is about balancing pleasure and pain. Okay? Most people think about motivation and reward and dopamine as just trying to achieve pleasure. And indeed, dopamine is released in the brain from the VTA at the nucleus accumbens when we experience things that we like. So here's the way to conceptualize this. And if you can internalize this in your mind, it will really help you as you move through your day, trying to understand why you might be motivated or not motivated for certain things. So when you're just sitting around, not doing much of anything, maybe you wake up in bed in the morning, you're thinking about getting up or not. If suddenly you get excited about something, you anticipate something, not receive an award, but you get excited in an anticipatory way, then the rate of firing, the rate of activity in this reward pathway suddenly increases to like 30 or 40 times. And it has the effect of creating a sense of action or desire to move in the direction of the thing that you're craving. In fact, it's fair to say that dopamine is responsible for wanting and for craving. And that's distinctly different from the way that you hear it talked about normally, which is that it's involved in pleasure. So yes, dopamine is released in response to sex. It's released in response to food. It's released in response to a lot of things, but it's mostly released in anticipation and craving for a particular thing. It has the effect of narrowing our focus for the thing that we crave. And that thing could be as simple as a cup of coffee. It could be as important as a big board meeting. It could be a big final exam. It could be the person that we're excited to meet or see. Dopamine doesn't care about what you're craving. It just releases at a particular rate. However, just thinking about food, about sex, about nicotine, if you like nicotine, or cocaine or amphetamine, can increase the amount of dopamine that's released to the same degree as actually consuming the drug. Now, it depends. In some cases, for instance, the cocaine user, the addict that wants cocaine, can't just think about cocaine and increase the amount that's released about 1,000-fold. It's actually much lower. But it's just enough to put them on the motivation track to crave that particular thing. Okay, great. I want more dopamine. I want to be more motivated. I don't want to procrastinate as much. Well, there is a way to do that, but you have to understand the source of procrastination is not one thing. There are basically two kinds of procrastinators, or so says the research. The first kind are people that actually really enjoy the stress of the impending deadline. It's the only way they can get into action. These are people that really like the feeling of, something being due in an hour and how activated and sharp and focused that makes them feel. I won't tell you what to do in order to overcome all kinds of procrastination, but from a logical perspective, it makes sense, therefore, for those kinds of people to think about other ways that they can get their system into activation. A couple of those tools might be what we've called superoxygenation breathing, which I admit is not always super oxygenating. So this would be, if you didn't want to consume anything, this could be 25 or 30 cycles of deep inhales and exhales. It's likely to create some anxiety and low-level stress. If you're someone who's prone to panic attacks, I wouldn't recommend this, but it's pretty straightforward. It will deploy adrenaline into your system, and you will find that your visual field is focused, and you will be able to work and focus better than if you just kind of waited around for some wave of motivation to wash over you. Normally, you're waiting for that deadline to come into sight, and then that's what the stimulus is. But you can self-direct adrenaline release without ingesting anything. You can also ingest caffeine. Caffeine does release dopamine at low levels. How much it releases dopamine isn't clear. It seems to increase firing in these neurons in the nucleus accumbens by about 30%, which is a pretty low level, but it can create agitation. So for caffeine-sensitive people, that could be a problem. However, if you think back to our earlier discussion about dopamine, if it's very high, creates a sense of pleasure and the desire for more. So you can also become a person for which enough is never enough. The only thing that dopamine really wants is more of the thing that releases dopamine. And so big inflections in dopamine, whether or not they come from cocaine or whether or not they come from a supplementation, caffeine, exercise, study regime, will just make you want more of something. And we've all heard before of growth mindset as really good for pursuit of goals and pursuit of things that require long bouts of effort. Well, it's wonderful if you can learn to attach dopamine to that process psychologically, but if you're starting to augment the amount of dopamine, increase the amount of dopamine through things like supplementation and prescription drugs, what's going to happen is you're not only going to need to pursue more and more of the sorts of things that are associated with the dopamine, so doing more studying, more sport, more pursuit, higher mountains, more money, more whatever, but we know that over time, the mirror image of that, the pain of lack of accomplishment, will also increase. This is the pleasure-pain relationship that we talked about earlier. Many people who have a big achievement, their first thoughts are, well, now what? What am I going to do next? How am I ever going to exceed that? And indeed, many people who are very high on this kind of dopamine sensation and novelty-seeking scale are prone to addiction. They're prone to the rabid pursuit of external goals, of exteroception, to the neglect of these internal mechanisms that allow them to feel calm and happy. So for people that are very driven, very motivated, adopting a practice of being able to engage in the here and now, the sort of Amen-type practices we talked about earlier, of learning how to achieve a really good night's sleep on a regular basis through tools and mechanisms I talked about in previous podcasts, gives us sort of balance to the pleasure-seeking and offsetting of pain and the pleasure in the here and now. So pleasure is really two things. It's a joy in pursuit, but it's also the joy in what you have.